I only speak for myself when I'm here, but I find this moment to be somewhat pivotal for me. To be sitting here next to Alexander Dugin. You know, the first time I heard the name Dugin, it was thrown at me as an epithet, and it was in 2014, and at that time I was a card-carrying member of a Marxist-Leninist political party, and at that time, folks will recall the overthrowing of the elected government of Ukraine and the installation of a pro-Western regime. And as that was taking place, I, based on my understanding of how to understand the world and the training that I'd received as a Marxist-Leninist, it appeared to me that what was happening should be opposed, and that, you know, that the forces in the East who were resisting this regime being imposed by the West, that they should be supported. And around that time, a number of people began to denounce me in left-wing circles. I was called a Nazbol. I was called a Strasserist. And one of the favorite epithets that people began throwing at me was I was called a Duginist. And I did not know what a Duginist was. I did not know who Alexander Dugin was. So I had to look into this. I had to look it up. And around that time, I was also traveling. In 2014, I first visited the Islamic Republic of Iran. I attended a conference in Iran. And I was in Iran, and I saw in Iran a society that had broken free from Western capitalism. Their national industries were under the control of the public. The oil was under the control of the public. The banking was under the control of the public. The state was working to mobilize the population to raise the living standards. It seemed to have broken free from this free market capitalist system that we had in the West. And when I was in Iran, I remember at this conference I attended, many of the guests from around the world said to me, "You've got to read the writings of Alexander Dugin." And then, oddly enough, I went to Venezuela. I was in Venezuela in 2015. And in Venezuela, you know, this was a Marxist government. You know, the leader was quoting, you know, Lenin and Trotsky and such. But I noticed that there was a clear difference in the way that the activists in Venezuela were talking. They talked a lot different than the leftists in the United States talked. And when I brought this up with the Venezuelans, they said to me, "Oh, you really ought to read Alexander Dugin." And so, you know, with all of these people mentioning Dugin to me, with people accusing me of being a Duginist, I thought it would be best that I actually study the writings of Alexander Dugin. So I had to get a copy of The Fourth Political Theory. And I read the book cover to cover. And it was fascinating to me, as someone who'd only really studied the political left and the ideology around it, to see a wider analysis of the world. And there were many things in the book that I did agree with. The most essential being this understanding of what liberalism is, and this understanding that there is this ideology coming out of, you know, the Western countries, the United States, Western Europe, and that seeks to put the individual above all else and break down any sense of collectivism or bond or community. And that this liberalism has a left-wing face and it has a right-wing face. And as I read The Fourth Political Theory, I noticed that I had been kind of aware of what he was describing in this text for a long time, because I myself, you know, I'm not from New York City, I'm not from Los Angeles, California, I'm from the heartland of the United States. I grew up in rural Ohio. You know, the town I lived in had less than 5,000 people in it. And I got attracted to left-wing ideas because I saw leaders like Fidel Castro, you know, and Kim Jong-il and others. And, you know, these are leaders that are leading their country, they're controlling the economy and raising people up out of poverty and you know, fighting against imperialism, and that's what I was attracted to. And when I got involved in organized political leftist groups, I noticed that there was something very, very different about them. That, you know, I would get excited about, you know, Fidel Castro and seeing, you know, revolutionary armies marching in uniforms and such. And the leftists would tell me, "Oh no, you know, we don't talk that way." You know, I would go to meetings and I would see people, you know, intentionally wearing clothes that were all ripped and had holes in them. And I would think, why are they not professional? Do they not want to look like serious politicians? I always felt very odd in left circles, and it was very strange. And I just felt like, you know, what had attracted me to the leftist ideology was very different than the people I was around. And then I began to do some reading, and I became aware of something which is, at this point, one of the programs that the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency brags about being its greatest achievement. And if you Google it, you can Google the phrase Congress for Cultural Freedom. And if you Google this, the first thing that will come up is the website of the U.S. CIA. And starting in 1949, there was a conference sponsored by the U.S. Communist Party and the Soviet Union in New York City at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. And it was a conference of artists and intellectuals and scientists, all of which were opposing the U.S. drive in the Cold War and were opposing U.S. imperialism. And the CIA looked at this conference and was furious about it. How could all these smart intellectuals, how could they be associated with the Soviet Union? And so they began a program, it's called the Congress for Cultural Freedom, in which they sought to create a gap between Western leftist intellectuals and the Soviet Union. And they noticed that this gap already existed to some extent, and that when the Soviet Union began, in the first years, it was promoting, an ultra-liberalism. Homosexuality was legalized, abortion was legal and such. But as the Soviet Union progressed, especially during the 5-year plans and the rise of Stalin, it became much more socially conservative. And many of the left-wing, cosmopolitan, middle-class intellectuals who'd been attracted to the Soviet Union, they were quite uncomfortable with what they saw as a social conservatism emerging in Soviet society. And the Central Intelligence Agency saw this cultural gap between the Western left and the Soviet Union as something that they could utilize to make a division. And they began funding magazines. There's a Trotskyist magazine called Partisan Review, which was circulated all across the United States. And a lot of the prominent names of the American left now, Noam Chomsky, Susan Sontag, they began with this publication. Furthermore, they funded art galleries. They promoted, what they call modern art. There's people just throwing art, throwing paint onto a canvas and saying this is art. It's progressive because it doesn't look like anything. And they did all kinds of things to try and influence the kind of circles where the Soviet Union and the Marxist-Leninist current had influence, and to try and pull them out of the Soviet sphere. And it's interesting, one of these intellectuals who was essentially, part of this program to divert leftism away from the Soviet Union was an individual named Susan Sontag. And in the 1980s, she was addressing a demonstration in New York City in support of the anti-Soviet uprisings in Poland. And she made a statement, and I read this statement and it really stuck with me. She said, "Communism is nothing but the most successful form of fascism." And when you read that statement, you think, what could she possibly mean? We know all the fascist leaders hated communism with all their heart and soul. That's what they were all about. And furthermore, all the communist leaders hated fascism with all that they were about. So what is she getting at? And the new or the modern left, if you really look at what they're about something quite different than the people who created the Soviet Union. And they're pushing quite a different agenda. And as I had been coming up as an activist and eventually going on my own ways and leaving the Marxist-Leninist group I had been a member of for almost a decade, I began to notice that all along I had been something different. When it got down to it, I was a populist. And populism in U.S. history, it's so bizarre that in every publication, the New York Times, the Foreign Affairs publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, anything in the United States, populism is the #1 enemy. It's what we're supposed to be afraid of. Populism is evil. Populism is bad. We need populism. There's Anne Marie Slaughter of the Council on Foreign Relations. She wrote an article saying the battle in the world today is the battle between the open international system, she called it, and populism. And populism is, it's Adolf Hitler, she says, it's Pinochet, but it's also Evo Morales, it's also Vladimir Putin, it's also Hugo Chavez. All of these populist regimes, they need to be replaced with the open international system, she's saying. And if you read U.S. history, populism really should be a good thing. I mean, there's a long history of populism in American history. Coming out of the Civil War and the struggle to abolish slavery, there was a populist party. And as the Republican Party moved into being more of a capitalist and a free market party, the mass movement of small farmers and radicals who had fought for the abolition of slavery in the United States, they formed the Populist Party, and they called for the nationalization of the railroads, and they called for the redistribution of land, and the fight against the big monopolies, and they fought for an interpretation of Christianity that would favor the downtrodden and the poor, and not favor greed and the rich, as was being promoted by some of the big denominations in the United States. And populism was being portrayed as a bad thing. We have individuals like Huey Long. Huey Long was the governor of Louisiana, the state in the United States during the 1930s, and he is, if you go to Louisiana, he is loved. Almost, so many bridges are named after him. There are monuments to Huey Long everywhere, and anyone who was alive during the time of Huey Long's governorship in the 1930s would tell you he was the most popular governor they ever had, and he was considered a populist. And he redistributed, he taxed the oil money, and he used it to feed people and care for people. But yet Huey Long, on a national scale, outside of Louisiana, where he actually had his power, is one of the most demonized figures in U.S. history. There's been fictionalized films, All the King's Men and such, and we hear, in our school textbooks, we learn that Huey Long was the dictator of Louisiana. But you go to Louisiana, everyone remembers him as being the greatest governor they ever had. They wouldn't have roads, they wouldn't have bridges, they wouldn't even have school textbooks if it weren't for Huey Long, the man who laid the foundation. So populism, it's been widely distorted, and the way you read it in the United States, it's almost as if to be a populist is the equivalent of being a Ku Klux Klansman. That's what we're told. If you're a populist, you want to dangle African Americans from trees and kill them, and that's just not the reality of what populism is. But because any notion of populism has really been abandoned by the left, we're starting to see this demonization of populism in all circles. In the United States, there is a real confusion about how to move forward, and the organized political left is kind of at a loss. A lot of the constituency in organized political leftist groups is very generational. It's been in their family for years. Their parents came to the United States in the 1920s or 30s, and they were members of the Communist Party. Then their children, grew up to be the 1960s New Left and opposed the Vietnam War and burned their draft cards. And now their children are Antifa and anarchists and breaking the windows of banks and attacking people and such. And that demographic in the United States is dying. Most of the individuals in that demographic no longer call themselves left. And this kind of urban, cosmopolitan, middle-class grouping that defined leftism in U.S. history is vanishing. However, there are many people in the United States who are opposed to capitalism. And during the presidential election, I'm a leftist, I come out of a left background, but I saw Donald Trump speak, and there were many times that he spoke and I applauded. I heard him talk about how, there's this elite that is not loyal to the United States, these international bankers. I applauded when he said that. When he talked about how, in Syria, or in Iraq, and all these countries, we have attacked them, and the result has been terrorism getting stronger, and that the U.S. population is gaining nothing from these wars. I applauded when he said that. Now, I didn't agree with Trump about certain issues like immigration, certain issues like empowering the policing agencies in the United States, but in many ways, Trump was better than Hillary Clinton when it came to the concerns that are important to me. Bernie Sanders, he was removed from the race, and we had the choice of Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. And there were many people who would have voted for Bernie Sanders who voted for Donald Trump in the election. Populism is the future. This future that's offered, you talk about the life that millennial Americans, that's what they call those of us in the United States born in the 1990s or the late 1980s, they call us millennials. And the future that is being offered to us by that by the society is very grim. Millennials, essentially, they are never allowed to become adults. They never are able to achieve the income level their parents had. They have a very low standard of living, and they essentially live out their adult life as if they're children almost. It's very weird. Anything that is conceived of as taking responsibility or growing up or being an adult is kind of frowned on. And young Americans are essentially encouraged to just permanently act like irresponsible children, to not have children of their own, to not buy homes of their own, to just kind of, work a low-paying job, use drugs, and just kind of live this lifestyle in which one pursues, hedonistic pleasures. And that's the future that the society is offering. And if you want to look beyond that, and if you want to talk about reorganizing U.S. society to serve the public and to serve the people in the U.S. society, and if you want to question foreign policy in the United States, the second you do that, you're called a fascist. And you cannot do that. To be a communist, one of the right-wing commentators in the United States, he put out on Twitter, he said that, communism is an ideology that can only appeal to those who hate themselves. And I looked at this and I thought, Fidel Castro, does he hate himself? Did Stalin hate himself? But if you look at the modern left, if you look at the people that are going around and protesting against Donald Trump, that makes sense. A lot of them are self-hating, and there's a real worship of weakness in left-wing circles. You know, anything that is perceived of as weakness or disempowering, that's worshipped. And anything that is conceived of as strength, or showing pride in oneself, or building up one's strength, that's attacked, and that's said, well, that's fascist. You can't be like that. The first thing that happens to young people when they go to the university and they take gender studies or race studies or queer studies is they're immediately told that, you know, that their identity, the way that they are as a person, is wrong, and they need to learn to hate themselves more. That's the message the left is giving young Americans, and not surprisingly, it's not a very attractive message. It's really not an attractive message, and it's not only for white Americans, I will say. You know, Black Lives Matter, which is this activist group that has been funded and supported by the highest levels of the U.S. political establishment, one of their primary goals is to attack the Nation of Islam, which is one of the most powerful black nationalist groups in the United States. And in just the recent months, there have been efforts and just a demand on every prominent black activist in the United States to denounce Louis Farrakhan. Why? Because Louis Farrakhan is a black fascist, we are told. He's anti-Semitic, he has said things about Jews that are not very nice, he's made statements about Hitler, so anyone, and the Nation of Islam that's the organization of Malcolm X. I mean, this is an organization with deep roots, but the demand coming from the left is that all black activists distance themselves from this organization because, again, it's pushing strength. It's not pushing shame. It's pushing an agenda of raising people out of poverty. It's pushing a black identity. So this is widespread, and what Mr. Dugin has described in his work, which, I mean, is very meaningful, and people are reading it all over the world, is very real, and people should engage with his ideas. When I first began researching Mr. Dugin, I remember there were so many interviews in English by experts on his work, and none of them had ever read his writings. You know, I mean, I would see interviews with people about Mr. Dugin, and they would say, well, you know, Alexander Dugin, he's written books about why Russia should take over the entire world and colonize the entire world. It's very interesting. I've read some of it myself, and this is what they said. And it's almost a caricature. But if you actually read what Dugin has to say, he's on point in many ways. Now, the only point of disagreement I would really have is that I do think that there is a notion of historical progress. And I think one of the primary activities that the global elite is engaging in right now is holding back progress. And that this left that they have unleashed essentially is a destructive left. The message that they give is that, you know, people have it too good these days, right? The environment is being destroyed. You know, we can't have people, you know, live more, you know, comfortable lifestyles. That'll destroy the earth, you know. And this notion that people should live a comfortable life, this is hedonistic, and we need to do more of an ancient Eastern thing. You know, the modern left is very much opposed to the notion of raising the world out of poverty, and they have this fascination with chaos and destruction. You know, the second that the revolution is victorious, they denounce it, right? Because then it's an autocratic regime, it's violating human rights. But as long as it's just people in the streets breaking windows, smashing things, tearing things down, they love it. You know, all throughout the United States, they are tearing down Confederate monuments, right? And the Confederacy was an awful thing. I mean, not just for African Americans, but for white people. I do not defend the Confederacy. But they're not replacing those statues with anything. Because the notion on the political left is not just that it's wrong to have Confederate statues. The notion is that it's wrong to have statues of anything. One shouldn't be worshiping anything. The idea that you have heroes that you aspire to become, this is wrong. That's the message that's coming out of the modern left that is very carefully funded and controlled. You can go back to the 1950s with the Congress for Cultural Freedom, but you know, there's a much more recent examples of their activities. I mean, at this point, I mean, the Institute for Policy Studies, the Rockefeller Foundations, the Ford Foundation, most people in the United States who espouse what appears to be a leftist ideology are being subsidized by the U.S. government, whether directly or indirectly. And it is an attempt to make sure that what we saw with Huey Long, what we saw with genuine American populism doesn't reemerge. And so, you know, the ideas that Mr. Dugin has promoted have been very meaningful for me in trying to make sense of what's going on in the world. And I thank you for the invitation to speak at this very important gathering. And I'm here learning. I'm hearing from different voices, and I'm open at this point, you know. The fact that there have been so many articles accusing me of being a Duginist before I even read Dugin's writings makes me think that there's something that I have to learn, so I'm here to listen.